Hello, welcome to Ethics, Chapter 2, our third lesson, which is on utilitarianism. It's going to be covered in your book on pages 61 through 69. Just excuse these funky lines, I accidentally made them there. So let's get started. So this was a warm-up we had on Schoology. It wasn't for a grade, so you don't have to worry about making it up. But your book proposes a question about how to handle an ethical situation. It was a real situation during World War II. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you what happened on, they give an ethical dilemma that Chamberlain faced during World War II. It's on page 62 of your text. So the poll asks you to consider, what would you do? Would you have let the bombing happen to protect your intelligence? Would you have warned the people of Coventry, or would you have done something different? So this is obviously something you can't make up, but I do want you to consider the dilemma. It's a good utilitarian ethical dilemma. And as I'm reading you the example on page 62, I'm going to be showing you some film clips of what the town looked like after the Blitz. So just one second. Okay, so here is a film of what happened in Coventry, and I'll read to you the ethical dilemma. During the beginning of World War II, the British succeeded in breaking the code the Germans used to communicate among themselves. Through a secret intelligence operation codenamed Ultra, the English were able to interpret and decipher radio German messages and gain critical information. Of course, they did not wish to let the Germans know of their advantage. This put them in a serious moral dilemma in November of 1940, when they learned that the Germans planned a heavy air raid on a densely populated city of Coventry. If they had warned the citizens there of what was coming and had helped to save their lives, the Germans would have figured out that they had broken the code, and they would have been unable to save other lives in the future and retain their intelligence advantage over the Germans. Winston Churchill decided not to warn the citizens of Coventry to evacuate. In the devastation of that raid, 400 people died, and thousands of others were injured and rendered homeless. In this instance, Churchill's rationale was clearly utilitarian. Though the British would initially suffer some casualties, he calculated that, in the long run, more lives and the well-being of more people would be preserved if the British did not immediately alert the public. So you're seeing in this old film some of the destruction that happened in Coventry, and that's what we're going to be looking at in this lesson, is the utilitarian ethical philosophy and how it works. And so if you were absent, we discussed this in class and did a poll. You don't need to make that up, but it's something to keep in your back of your mind as we're talking about utilitarianism. Okay, so your book mentions that what we call utilitarianism today was probably first traced back to Epicurus back in the 300s BC, and even Plato. But in terms of modern history, Jeremy Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, and then later John Stuart Mill were the ones who basically came up with utilitarianism as we know it today. So one of the things about utilitarianism is, unlike Kant's moral philosophy, which tends to be rather abstract and a bit counterintuitive, just like Kant, they wanted to base it on reason alone and on logic, not on like divine revelation. However, utilitarianism tends to be a little bit more a little bit easier to understand and more practical. It's pretty easy to grasp. And so the basic overall idea is the morality or the ethical quality of an act is a function of what follows from it. So ultimately, it's what we would call consequentialist. And so remember that Kant argued that the consequences of an act ultimately don't matter. It's the quality of your will. It is the act itself good or bad. But the utilitarian philosophy is based on the consequences of the act, and pretty much only the consequences. An act is good if good things happen, flow from it. An act is bad if bad things happen from it. So let's take a little closer look at this. So utilitarianism gets its name from the principle of utility. Whoops, that's wiggling around on me. The principle of utility. And so basically the idea is the right choice is the one that results in the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So in the example we started with the Project Ultra, was Churchill reasoned that protecting their intelligence would bring about a greater happiness, a greater safety, and protect more lives than warning the people of Coventry. So you had 400 people lost at Coventry, but how many people, extra lives, were saved, and how by not revealing the British intelligence secrets to the Germans. So it's almost sort of like a mathematical equation or a proportion in making your decisions. And so the question becomes, what do they mean by happiness? And Mill was pretty straightforward. On page 63, if you want to reference any of this in your text, Mill basically says happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain, whereas unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure. And so unlike Aristotle, who defined happiness as a human type of flourishing, so humans have reason, which allows them to act virtuously, act with virtue, and that's what happiness is. That's what will fulfill us. For Mill, he would say even sentient animals can experience happiness. So they can experience a lack of pain. And he saw happiness as the ultimate end. So what is good in and of itself? It's happiness. Now, this doctrine is known as, this is spelled wrong, hedonism. Hedonism. Did I spell that right? Excuse me, hedonism. Wait, D-O-N. So Hedon. ISM. So hedonism, when we use the phrase today in popular culture, it really means pleasure seeking. So if someone calls you hedonistic, and in particular with things like bodily desires like food and sex, it's a very pejorative thing. The way Mill is using it is a little bit differently. He is saying again that the good in and of itself is pleasure. And unlike now, a hedonist today is really into more base pleasures, things that are more bodily, whereas Mill argued that there are higher and lower forms of pleasure. So a higher form would be reading a novel or going to an art gallery, and a lower form of pleasure would be not eating a steak, or if you're a vegetarian, I don't want to offend you, a really good salad. So what he ultimately thought was that people, once they try all the types of pleasures, they will prefer the higher pleasures. So things like helping others, pursuing the truth, creating art. So Mill's understanding of hedonism wasn't that it was going to make people go to the lowest common denominator. They would be focused on types of pleasure that we would say are lower, like, eating a lot of candy or having sex with whoever you wanted. Mill argued that those are lower forms of pleasure, and when you actually experience higher ones, you will prefer them. And so it's important to mention that, because we don't want to have the idea that Mill is talking about the type of hedonism we would see today in, say, a place like Las Vegas. He thinks that ultimately people would prefer higher forms of pleasure. Okay, so ultimately, utilitarianism demands that we strive not just for ourselves, but for the highest forms of pleasure for the most people. So that's why the scale is kind of a good image for trying to understand what utilitarianism is about. So the utilitarian must give the happiness of each person the same weight. So this is something about the utilitarian, is you must ultimately think of everyone. And that means that sometimes the utilitarian will be called on to make sacrifices, even of his own life. So the idea here is, when trying to look at a situation, and utilitarianism is really about weighing options. So if you have a number of options, like Winston Churchill did, warn the people, don't warn the people, you should try to take the perspective of a disinterested and benevolent spectator. So imagine, and you have to throw yourself in with everyone else. So you have to imagine, okay, what would be the best for everybody, even if that means sacrificing my own life. So for instance, for Winston Churchill, what if all of his family lived in Coventry? Would he make the same choice? So he has to try to be completely disinterested. So this raises an interesting question as to whether any person can actually do that in practice, but this is what utilitarianism demands. So what John Stuart Mill argued was, this is ultimately what Jesus taught: love of neighbor as oneself. Mill is like, hey, look, if one actually loves his neighbor and puts his neighbor's needs at the same level of his own needs, that's utilitarianism. That's what the world would look like. And so ultimately, utilitarianism at first glance kind of seems really practical, but it ends up having a rather high moral demand. It means that you're going to have to value everyone and everyone else's needs as equal to your own. So again, this seems simple at first, but then it kind of gets a little bit more difficult when you actually think about how it would work out in practice. So after Mill, there are many different ways that people made adjustments to the utilitarian idea. But some of the things that the common ground that they have in common is, in moral decision making, the only intrinsic goods should be taken into account. So John Stuart Mill thought ultimately that the only intrinsic good was pleasure. They also mentioned G.E. Moore in your book. He was a philosopher who thought knowledge and beauty were also intrinsic goods. Incidentally, just to add, as Catholics, we have three things called the transcendentals. These would be intrinsic goods to a Catholic, and they are truth, beauty, and goodness. Just to add that in as a reflection, this is what we would say are transcendental goods, or intrinsic goods. So ultimately, the way utilitarianism would work is almost as a mathematical equation. So you weigh options and choose whichever choice results in the most good for most people. And the utility of any given choice is basically you look at the good, you look at the bad, and then you get the utility. So in the case of Winston Churchill, he looked at the pain caused by protecting ultra, and the pain caused by, or maybe you could say I guess maybe what ultra would go over here. The good of protecting ultra, that would be the pleasure, and the pain caused at Coventry. Ultimately, he decided that he made the decision that the amount of good coming out of protecting ultra outweighed the pain of the people of Coventry. So once again, we see that there is a very it's very useful, because Kant's philosophy. Remember, Kant was very almost esoteric, and he has his categorical imperatives, remember? But the problem with Kant's categorical imperatives is what if you have competing duties? Because Kant was all about the moral duty, but what if you have two duties? Winston Churchill had a duty to protect Coventry. He had a duty to protect ultra. Kant's philosophy doesn't really help very much in choosing one duty over the other. So one of the benefits of utilitarianism is it is pretty straightforward. So let's just think about, I've already started talking about this, but let's compare this with Kant. Okay, on page 66 of your text, the text looks at the kind of the Kantian response to utilitarianism. So Kant argued that consequences don't matter in deciding morality, whereas utilitarians would consider only the consequences. So they give the example. Remember, I gave you the lifeboat example at the very beginning of our study. And they kind of asked, what would Kant say and what would a utilitarian say in that situation? So for Kant, in the lifeboat situation, he would argue that you can't ultimately kill the person, the sick guy, because that act in and of itself would violate the principle of the universal law. If you were the one being killed, you wouldn't want that happen to you. Also, it totally uses the person as a means to an end. Like you're literally going to eat the guy, right? Whereas the utilitarian would say, hey, look, there are two well people versus one sick person. It makes more sense. It would cause us more pleasure to eat him compared with the amount of pain. And then also it would give us a better chance to survive. So if we take the life of the one, ultimately it gives the rest of us a better chance at survival. And so whereas Kant would rather starve to death than kill the guy, the utilitarian would argue, well, it's, ultimately, it's a better calculation to kill the one to save two others. One of the problems with utilitarianism, I think that you see is utilitarianism sometimes is operating out of a lot of guesswork. So utilitarianism bargains on the fact that you're making the right gamble. And as your book says, making a moral decision is not a crapshoot, is not a matter of calculating the possibilities of various possible outcomes, is our actions or intentions themselves that are right or wrong, regardless of what happens to result from them. And so that's sort of the Kantian argument against utilitarianism. You know, you're playing with real people's lives here, and there's a lot at stake. And another criticism of utilitarianism, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I've already kind of been looking at this. So some of the pros of utilitarianism would be, as Catholics, we would agree consequence can decrease the blameworthiness of an action. So again, everything's kind of on a scale, bad versus good. Consequences are important. Unlike Kant, we would say that they aren't. Kant said they don't really matter at all. But as Catholics, we would say they do matter. If there's, it does increase blameworthiness. There's a difference between, shooting a burglar in the leg and, say, killing him. Another thing is, we might respect the idea of being a benevolent spectator because that kind of follows with the golden rule. We should look at the other as ourself. And another pro is ultimately utilitarianism is all about the common good. It's doing the best for the most people. And as Catholics, we also promote, especially in our social justice ethics, which we'll study next semester, promoting the common good of everyone. And in this case, not just the people of your town or your nation, but of the entire human family. Now, some of the drawbacks is we would argue that no act that is intrinsically evil can be made good by its results. This is said by Paul in Romans. And the Catechism also paraphrases Paul and says, you can't do evil so that good may come of it. And from the Catechism, these are what we identify as the intrinsic moral evils that are wrong every single time you do them. First is blasphemy. That's like using the Lord's name in vain. Perjury, which is lying under oath. Murder, which is the premeditated killing of someone with and your intention is bad. Adultery, fornication. Fornication is sex outside of the marriage bond, and abortion. So these are acts the church defines as evil anytime they happen. It doesn't matter if a good consequence comes from it. All of these actions are either an affront to human dignity, or an affront to, for example, the truth, as in perjury or blasphemy. So utilitarianism basically means under the right circumstances, any act is permissible. And remember, we talked about in the first chapter, a lot of you wrote about if there's moral actions that are always wrong. One I would add to this list that kind of falls under fornication in a sense is rape. A utilitarian would argue that under the right circumstances, rape can be justified. And as Catholics, we would argue no, some things are always wrong. Now the question becomes, what does it mean if you do something that's wrong? This is where levels of blameworthiness come into play. Are you going to be like Kant and maybe go down with the ship on your morals because of your will, and you will not besmirch your goodwill? Or would you, if you had to, do something you knew was wrong and face the consequences for that? And so in your book, it talks about some of the utilitarian philosophers, and they mention one, for example, a man named Singer. Let me find it. Where did it go? He argued basically that, I'm trying to find it for you. He said that there should be like a survival lottery. So some people need organs, right? So the idea here was Singer argued that you should have a lottery, and that if you get, oh, here it is. Oh, this is John Harris proposed the survival lottery. The survival lottery is Harris. Oh, there it is. I wrote it there. Survival lottery is the idea that each year many people die waiting for organ transplants. But his idea was that everybody would give in a number, and then if your number is picked, then you have to give up your organs to save other people. So would you want to live in a world like that? That's where Kant comes in. You're like, well, what if I'm the one person that wants to die? If you're the one that wants the organs, it works out. Not if you're the one that's going to die, or your kid. Another question is the philosopher. Let's see. I'm trying to remember his first name. Where is it? Singer has argued. I want to say it's Peter Singer, but I can't find it here. But he's argued that the utilitarian concern for the welfare of others doesn't extend to innocent individuals like unborn children and useless human beings such as the retarded, the handicapped, or the elderly. So Singer and utilitarians of his bent say we should sacrifice these people for the purpose of eugenics. So just basically get them out of the gene pool. So they're worthless, so just get rid of them. And obviously, as Christians, we would say, oh, heck no. Every life, all life is intrinsically valuable. So just because you're born with Down syndrome doesn't mean you should get a death sentence. So especially in terms of valuing all human life equally, at first, utilitarianism looks really good on paper, but when you start like looking at the practical implications, it can get kind of scary. So just like with all the philosophies we looked at, utilitarianism has some strong points and some weak points as Christians we would be wary of. So I don't have a separate assessment for this chapter. I'm going to wait till the next, for this lesson. I'm going to wait till the final assessment for the chapter to bring in utilitarianism. And our fourth and final lesson will be on rights-based ethics. What is the relationship between the idea of having rights and ethical decision-making? If you have any questions, please let me know.